Okay, so this is an explanation for prep test 71, game number 1. If we look at the opening passage or the overview, it says a movie studio is scheduling the release of 6 films, F through L. No 2 of these films can be released on the same date. So what that means for me is I actually can't have multiple entities stacking up on top of each other. So if we were to set this up, right, it would look like this. So we have our entities F, G, H, J, K, L. And I like to just put the total number of entities up at the top right. And I have my 6 slots. And the main thing to keep in mind here is I'm trying to determine the release of these 6 films, right? That's ultimately what I'm trying to figure out. And I also know that no 2 of these films can be released on the same date. What that means for me is these are the days, right? And these are the films. So if I can't have 2 films on the same day, that means I can't have F and G stacking up on top of each other, just as an example. So once I place an entity F anywhere, there's no one else who can join it in that particular slot. So these types of little details matter because there can be games where you can have entities stacking up on top of each other. So we want to be aware of that. So another thing to keep in mind here is that each entity is used once. And we also know that every single one of them is going to show up on the game board. So based on that, let's dive into the rules. The first rule says F must be released earlier than both J and L. So the way that we're going to diagram this is I'm going to have F, J, L branching out of it just like this. The important thing to recognize is I don't know the relationship between J and L. J could still go before L or after it. All I know is that they both go after F. From there, the next rule says K must be released earlier than J, and J must be released earlier than H. So if I were to diagram this rule out individually, it would look like this. So K is earlier than J. And by the way, when in doubt, just break the rule up into pieces, right? The first piece just says K must be earlier than J. I'm going to diagram that. Then I'm going to look at the next piece that says J must be released earlier than H. And one thing to notice is I can actually link that up directly to J, just like this. So the next thing to recognize, though, is we actually see a repeated entity between these 2 rules. So that in turn tells me that I actually might be able to combine these. So if you saw that right away, even better. But if you notice it as you're diagramming out, that's totally fine. I'm going to go ahead and link up K just like this. Then I'm going to say J goes before H. Okay, so that's that. I'm going to move on to the next rule, which happens to be the final rule. And this one says L must be released earlier than G. And again, I can technically diagram it out separately. But once again, we can recognize that L is repeated here. And so I can actually link up G between these 2 rules. So there you have it. After diagramming these rules, I'm able to combine them into one big chain. And whenever you have big chains like this, it's a good idea to take into account who could be at the very beginning of the chain and who could be at the very end of the chain. It just so happens that a lot of times that's typically what the questions are centered around and what the deductions are centered around. So let's take a look here. How many entities have we taken care of? If you, one thing to notice is I have 6 entities involved in this chain, and I also have 6 entities in total. This is part of why I actually list out the total number of entities up here. It's just to kind of help recognize these types of situations. So that means there's no other entities that I've left out at this point. Okay, so whoever could be at the very beginning of the chain at this point is the definitive list, right? I know that for sure. So there's a real easy way, or at least I should say a simple way, to determine who could be at the very beginning of the chain. And the way to do that is to just see which letters don't have a line directly in front of them. Okay, because if it has a line directly in front of it, that means another entity goes before it. And in that case, it just cannot go first. So for me, that is K and F. I only have those 2 entities as options. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in to my very first slide. And I can do the same thing for determining who could go at the very end of the chain, right? It can only be H and G. I can determine this by saying, what are the entities that don't have any lines or chains after them? Okay, and those are only H and G. Okay, and so when you have these big chains, that's really all you need to determine. From here, I'm ready to move on. I do need to be very, very cognizant of these relationships, though. I don't want to get these mixed up. The most important thing to recognize here is I actually know that L needs to go before G. I know that J needs to go before H. However, we have to be very careful in understanding that L actually can go before or after H. We actually don't know that relationship for sure. Okay. J can go before or after G. The reason why we don't know the relationship between J and G, for example, is because if we just look at it from the chain perspective, I know that F goes before J and J goes before H, right? That's all I know just from the direct chain. There's nothing that tells me directly J's relationship to G. Okay. Another way to kind of think about it is I want you to imagine that these lines are train tracks. Okay. They're train tracks. And in order to determine if we know the relationship between two entities, I need to see if there's any change in relationship to go from one entity to another. Okay. So if you think about it, to go from one destination to another, I would either need to go from left to right or right to left. Okay, so let me just kind of show you how this works in real time. So I'm going to use a different color here. Now, if I have this type of setup, let's say I'm trying to determine if I know the relationship between F and G. Then that means I need to start from F and go to G, or I could go the other way around. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to imagine that these lines are train tracks. And I can't just jump from one entity to another. I have to follow the train track to get from point A to point B. So then I'm going to say, okay, well, how do I get from F to G? Well, first I'm going to have to go from F to L. That's left to right. Then I got to go from L to G. That's also left to right. So notice how there's no change in direction. I'm not going from left to right, then right to left. I'm going the same way throughout, which means I do know the relationship. F actually must go before G. Now, conversely, what if I was trying to see if I knew the relationship between G and J? Okay, so if I'm trying to go from G to J, let's see how that plays out. So again, I have to follow the train, right? So that means I'm going from G to L first. Okay, so that's from right to left. Then I got to go from L to F. That's still right to left. Then finally, I got to go from F to J. But notice how that's going from left to right. Okay, so now that's a change in direction. So therefore, I do not know the relationship there. Okay, so that's going to be something that I might be alluding to as we're kind of going through the questions. But that's ultimately, if you're ever unsure, that's ultimately how you want to check if we know the relationship between two entities or not. So from here, we can now dive into the questions. And a good strategy to use is to actually start off with the questions that start with if. Okay, in this case, that's question number 3 and question number 4. And also to start out with the acceptability questions. These are the questions that ask you, what is a possible arrangement of all of the entities? It just so happens in this particular game, we don't have that question. Okay, but ordinarily, that's what you want to do. The reason why we're starting with these if questions is, as you'll see in just a minute, the game boards that you create from these questions can actually help you with the other question types. So let's start off with question number 3. So question number 3 says, if G is released earlier than H, each of the following could be true except, right? So in this particular case, I'm going to first start off with just drawing G earlier than H. It's okay if you don't know exactly where it goes, right? But you want to just start off with diagramming out the new rule off to the side. Now from here, let's see if there's anything that I can link it up to. And sure enough, I do see G up here. I also see H up here, right? It just so happens. So, so from here, the question is, how do we link this up, right? This is where a lot of people struggle because they're not sure how to link things up to these types of big chains. My recommendation to you is just take it one at a time, but just be very, very mindful that we have two entities involved in this chain. So just to kind of illustrate this, I'm going to kind of move GH down a little bit just so that I have a bit more room. And again, I'm going to take it one at a time. It doesn't really matter who I start with. I can start with G, I can start with H. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to start with G just for the sake of simplicity. Okay, so first I have G, and I'm going to just ask myself, what is G directly linked to? Right, that's it. And sure enough, of course, I see that G is directly linked to L. So I'm just going to add that in. Okay. And remember, again, there's nothing else directly linked to J, or I'm sorry, to G. So now I just move on. I just move on to what I just added, which is L. I'm going to say, okay, well, what have I linked to L? I've linked F to it. So F goes before L. Boom. Okay, so I have a pretty big chain so far. And there's nothing else directly linked to L, right? So now I move on to F. What is directly linked to F? J. Boom. I'm going to add J in just like that. What is J directly linked to? J is actually linked directly to K and to H, right? So I need to show both of those relationships. So, but it's pretty straightforward to do that, right? So first I'm going to start with K. I'm just going to directly link that to J. And then I know that J needs to appear before H. Now remember, some people might think this diagram alone suffices, and that's enough to say that J goes before H, but that's actually not true. And just based on this diagram alone, we actually don't know the relationship between J and H, because if we use the train track method again, right, if I'm trying to go from J to H, the way to get there would be I would need to first go from J to F, which is left to right. Then I would need to go from F to L, which is right to left. So immediately there's a change in relationship on my way to H, which means that I do not know the relationship there. So I need to make it abundantly clear that J does in fact go before H. So I am going to connect that line. Okay, so now there's a direct link between them, which means that no matter what, there has to be some type of relationship there. Okay, so from here, the next thing is I need to actually relate it to my game board, right? I need to see if there's anything further that I can deduce. And so I'm going to draw out my new game board, which I always encourage you to do whenever you have if questions, because like I was saying before, you can use that information to help you out with other questions, as we'll see in just a minute. So one thing to recognize is, again, if I use this method of trying to determine who are the leaders, who are the very end of this, or at the very end of the chain, we said K or F could be at the very beginning, and that still holds true in this case, right? Notice how there's no chains going directly to the left of K or F. So either of them can go there. Who could be at the very end of the chain? In this case, notice how H is actually the only one who could go last. Okay, because now G has to go before H, so there's no way G could go last. Okay, so that's just something that we want to be aware of. As for the rest of the chain, another thing to notice is, you know, from here, we can just kind of move on to the question. There's nothing else that we've really need to necessarily add on to the board at this particular point in time, but just keep in mind, we're going to need to continue referring to this chain. So if we go into the question, it says, if G is released earlier than H, then each of the following could be true except. So let's go through these one by one. A says G is released fourth. Let's kind of consider that, okay? And the way to do that is to just ask yourself, how many entities need to go before G, right? So I have L that needs to go before G, F needs to go before G, but this is again where we need to understand those relationships. These are the only two entities that need to go before G, okay? Because for K and J, if I'm trying to go from K to G, there's going to be a change in direction. If I'm trying to go from J to G, there's also going to be a change in direction. So F and L are the only ones. So that means G could very well have just two entities before it, okay? So that means no matter what, G cannot go into 1 or 2, but G could go into 3. And also there doesn't seem to be anything preventing G from going into 4, right? Because, you know, H is the only one that absolutely needs to go after G. So there's nothing preventing that from happening. But remember, by asking if which one of the following could be true, except it's really asking, it's really saying that all of the incorrect answer choices will be something that could be true. And the correct answer choice will actually be something that must be false. Okay. So that's something that you want to be aware of. So because G seems like it could be true, it is not the correct answer. Okay. So moving on to B, B says J is released third. Let's take a look and see if this is something that seems possible. Let's see which entities absolutely have to go before J. K and F absolutely have to go before J, but those are the only two that need to go before J, right? There's no other entities that don't have a change in relationship in relation to J, except for H, which goes after it. So from here, that means I don't see anything immediately stopping J from going into 3. Okay, so that seems like it could be true, therefore it is incorrect. C says K is released second. Okay, so same idea here, right? K doesn't have anyone that needs to go before it. There's nothing stopping just F from going before it. Seems like it's a possible situation. D says L is released third. Okay, so again, same idea here. There's only F that seems like it needs to go before L. There's no other entities that are preventing L from going third. So that doesn't seem like it's going to be an issue. Finally, E says L goes fifth. And this is where finally we see our correct answer. If I take a look at L, there's, like we were saying before, only one entity that needs to go before it. However, there are two entities that need to go after it, right? So that means G and H at a bare minimum need to go after L, which means there's no way L could go into 5, right? If I were to try to place L into 5, G would have to go into 6, and then H would have nowhere to go. Okay, so for that reason, E is in fact our correct answer here. Okay, moving on to the next if question, which is number 4. Number 4 says, if L is earlier than K, which one of the following could be true? So again, I'm starting out with my chain diagram. So L is before K. And I'm going to use that same exact linking strategy we talked about, right? So it doesn't really matter who I start with. Maybe I can start with K. So K is directly linked to who? It's directly linked to J. And that's it, right, for K. So then next up, I got to say, well, who's linked to J? And the answer is both H and F. Okay, so I know that H is directly linked to H afterward. F is directly linked to J before it. But I need to now consider the fact that F is also linked to L, right? So technically, you might be tempted to immediately add this in, and it's okay if you do. Just keep in mind that later on, you would then recognize that F actually goes before L as well. So how do we do that? Well, if L is already before J and F goes before L, then F is before both L and J. So all I need to do is this, and that particular portion of the chain is accounted for. Okay, so I've taken care of all of these entities. Now the next thing is just looking at J, or I'm sorry, looking at L. L is linked directly to G, right? L goes immediately, or not immediately before, but L goes somewhere before G. So I can link that on. Now I've taken care of my entire chain, right? And again, if I use my sub game board, consider who are the leaders, who are the followers. In the very beginning, first thing to recognize is F actually has to go into 1. And also another thing to recognize here is even once I don't consider F anymore, right? The next in line has got to be L, right? So L actually needs to go into 2. So that's a good thing to kind of add in there. So L needs to go into 2. Then, G or K, either one could go into 3, right? So that's just something to be aware of. You can add that in if you want, because G or K are the only ones next in line. Now, at this point, though, we have to be careful, because this is where a lot of times people will get tempted to also put G/K in 4, but that's not necessarily true. I could easily have K in 3 while J in 4, right? That's still a possibility. So there's nothing I can really add into 4 at this particular time. So when that happens, I'm just going to start from the other side of the chain. Remember, we said we're also going to consider who could be the followers, right? And the first thing to recognize here is I got to have H or G last. Okay. So, and we know that, by the way, because there's no chain after G, there's no chain after H, right? So that's just something to be aware of. And this is really the extent of it, right? This is the extent of it. And this is when we're ready to move on to the answer choices. So it's asking us which one of the following could be true. Let's go through them. A says L is released third. Well, that actually must be false, right? We've actually immediately deduced that L actually must go second. So that one's out. B says L is released fourth. Again, same thing, right? We've already talked about L, so B is out. C says H is released earlier than L. There's no way that can happen, right? F actually needs to go before L. So that's also something that must be false. D says J is released earlier than G. And let's take a look here. Okay, going back to this chain, do we know the relationship between J and G? No. So that means J could go before G or after G. So this goes back to our discussion earlier. If I was to use the train track method, right? If I'm trying to go from G to J, how am I going to do that? Well, I would first need to go from G to L, going from right to left. Then I would need to go from L to K, going from left to right in order to arrive at J. So that's already a problem because there's a change in direction. So we don't know the relationship. Therefore, D is confirmed as the correct answer. But let's take a look at E just for good measure as well. So E says J is released earlier than L. We actually know that J has to go after L based on this chain, right? This time we actually know the relationship between the two because, I mean, for one, you could just recognize that just by looking at our subgame board. If L goes into 2, F goes into 1, J actually has to go after L. But secondly, another thing to recognize here is there is no change in relationship. If I'm going from L to K, I'm going from left to right. If I'm going from K to J, I'm still going from left to right. Okay, so that is it for our if questions. Now let's kind of see how this plays out with our remaining questions. So now I'm going to move on to question number 2, which simply asks what must be true, right? It's just asking what must be true in general. So I don't really have anything specific. So A says F is released earlier than H, right? And one thing to keep in mind here is you have so much information now at your disposal to help you out. So you can look at your main game board and say, well, I see F here, I see H here. Do I know the relationship there? And the answer is yes, right? If I'm going from F to J, I would need to first go from left to right to get to J. Then I would need to go from left to right to get to from J to H. So there is definitely a relationship there, meaning F actually does in fact need to go earlier than H. A is therefore our correct answer. B says J is released earlier than G. Now this could be true, right? It certainly is possible because I don't know the relationship between J and G for reasons we discussed earlier. However, it doesn't have to be true, right? So that's one thing that we need to understand. It still could be false. So C says K is earlier than G. Again, we don't know the relationship between K and G. I would need to change directions to get from K to G. So therefore, I do not know the relationship, meaning K does not have to go earlier than G. D says L is released earlier than H. Same idea here. If I use my main game board, don't know the relationship between L and H, I would need to change directions. Finally, for E, it says L is released earlier than J. Same exact thing. We don't know the relationship there. Okay, so that's number 2. I skipped over question 1 by mistake. So let's go back to question 1. It says, which of the following cannot be true? Okay, A says F is released second. Okay, so let's see if there's anything preventing that from happening. Well, I could easily have just K go before it, right? We know that because we have K/F in slot 1. So I could have K in 1, and then I could have F in 2. I don't see anything preventing that from happening. So A is incorrect because it could be true. B says G is released third. And even if you didn't kind of immediately see that from our chain here. We could look down at our sub game board, right? And we could see that G could go into 3. I could have G or K in 3. So that's why, having these inferences or these game boards can be beneficial. Now, that being said, let's kind of look at how we could have determined this even from just seeing our main game board, right? So how could G go third? Well, the only entities that absolutely have to go before it are F and L, right? Those are the only entities that we truly know the relationship with, right? Because everyone else, to get from G to the other entities, we would need to change directions. So therefore, there is nothing stopping me from having F in 1, L in 2, G in 3. That is totally possible, okay? So that is why that one is wrong. C says H is released 4th. Okay, so let's see if there's anything preventing that from happening. Well, if I look over here, once again, I have K that needs to go before H. J also needs to go before H. F also needs to go before H. Okay, notice how all 3 of these don't have a change in direction to get to H. So that seems okay though, right? Because if there's 3 entities going before it, then H could still go here and have room for the 3 other entities before it, right? So there's nothing preventing that from happening. So therefore, C is incorrect because it could be true when we're looking for what cannot be true. B says K is released 4th. Okay, so for K going into 4th, I could have F, L, and G, right? So the main thing to recognize here is F, L, and G. Those are 3 entities that could go before K because I don't know the relationship between these 3 entities and K. So that means K could go into 4. Okay, so that's a little tricky to you might miss that in the chain if you're not careful here because L and G are further to the right than K. So just remember, don't just focus on the geographic location of the entities. Always look into, do I know the relationship or not? Finally, E says K is released 5th, and that's where we draw the line, right? Because which one of the following entities absolutely must go after K? J and H do, right? So that's 2 entities going after K, meaning that there's no way K could go in either 5 or 6. Because what if I tried to place K into 5, right? If I try to place K into 5, then J would maybe need to go in 6, but H falls off a cliff. He has nowhere to go. Okay, so for that reason, E is our correct answer. Okay, so that leaves us with question number 5, which is the classic rule substitution question that everybody despises. Well, let's read through it. It says, which of the following, if substitute for the condition that F must be earlier than both J and L, would have the same effect on the order in which the films are released? So this is something that I always talk about in terms of strategy in my courses and in my tutoring. But just for the sake of time here, I'm going to try to simplify this as much as possible. The most important thing to recognize that this question is really asking you for is it's really just asking you for a rule that could replace the rule in the question without changing anything. And so let's consider that real quick. What is the rule? The rule is F must be earlier than both J and L. In fact, it's actually pointing to this specific portion of the rule, okay? So I'm going to be laser focused on that. And I need to ask myself, is the answer choice doing just that? Is it setting it up to where F goes before J and L and nothing else? So I'm going to go into the answer choices here. A says only K can be released earlier than F. If you notice, this actually does make sense. If K is the only entity that could go before F, that means everyone else must go after F. And that just so happens to include J and L, right? J and L would be involved in everyone else. So therefore, A is actually my correct answer. It's doing what the rule or what the question was asking, right? It's setting it up to where F, in fact, does go before J and L. But let's take a look at the rest of the answer choices just for good measure, because I know a lot of times people resort to process elimination for these types of questions. B says K must be released earlier than L. Well, we actually know that that simply just doesn't have to be true, right? K actually, we don't know the relationship between K and L. And also, how does that even set up F to go before J and L, right? It doesn't even mention F. So I don't know anything about F's relationship to J and L at that point. So B is out. D says F must be released either first or second. Well, regardless of whether F goes in 1 or 2, that still doesn't tell me where F goes in relation to J and L. That's a problem. Okay, so C is out. D says F must be released earlier than both K and L. Again, first off, F doesn't even need to go before K. But secondly, F does tell this rule, this answer choice does tell me about F and L, but it tells me absolutely nothing about F and J, right? So that doesn't help me either. Finally, E says either F or K must be released first. Same exact issue as all the other incorrect answer choices. It doesn't tell me anything about F relationship to J and L, which is what we're really focused on. So that is why A is our correct answer here.